Somebody told me that the Army was taking people that were 17 and a half, and the fellow didn't know I was only 15. So I went down and I talked to the recruiter, and he said, yeah, we'll take you. He said, but you have to have a birth certificate. So I went to get my birth certificate, and they couldn't find it. And in those days, they used to write it in by hand. So anyway, I went back to see the recruiter, and I told him they can't find my birth certificate. He said, that's all right. So it happens all the time. And in those days, it really did. But anyway, he said, we'll take it. So they took me. I went into basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky as a tank crewman. And after that, it was all prologue. Shall I go on with what happened?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, well, when I got through with basic training, at that time they couldn't make up their mind whether the war was about finished in Europe or not. And they told whoever it was that needed to know this information that to cut back on the length of time for the basic training. So because they cut back, why I got as far as crewing a M24 light tank, which was new at the time. They hadn't even brought them to Europe yet. So I knew all about that thing, and it was a great tank compared to the Sherman because it was like a sports car. The Sherman was more like a lumber wagon, if you want to compare the two. So anyway, when I graduated from basic training, they sent me to Fort Ord, California, and they said I was going to take a bunch of LVTs, landing vehicle tracked. I don't know whether you know what those are or not. But there were 4 versions of them. 2 of them carried a turret off an M5 light tank, one with a 37 millimeter, and then the assault gun had a short barrel 75 millimeter like airborne used. So we took them over to France, landed at Le Havre, and put them on flatbeds and took them into Antwerp, gave them to the British. Apparently, General Eisenhower told Montgomery that he wanted the estuary leading into Antwerp opened up so that they could bring supplies in through the estuary there into the Antwerp town. They had the town, but they didn't have the port. So anyway, I guess that's what they did with it, because I went to what they called the cigarette camps. Don't know whether you know what that is or not, but at that time, they had 3 cigarette camps in just outside of Le Havre, and they were named after famous cigarettes at that time. Philip Morris, Old Gold, and Lucky Strike. So anyway, I was in Old Gold, and I was there about a week or so. Finally, a truck came in and took a bunch of us and took us out to the units we were going to be assigned to, which was, for me, the 740th Tank Battalion. The 740th had trained in the Arizona desert as a Canal Defense Light, which was a code name, top secret name at that time. Thank God they declassified it. But it was a special turret that was put on a Sherman tank that instead of having a main gun on the turret, they had 2 slits. And inside they had a high, you know the old movies where they used to shine the movie up your head onto a screen? That same type of camera, only it was just a light. And they shined it to the rear of the turret and had a convex mirror in there. And it would shine this bright light through these 2 slits, and then an operator could flick this thing to make the lights go on and off. Well, it didn't work. I guess it worked for the British in North Africa, but we never used it in North Africa. So anyway, our unit was sent over to Wales, and they had to train some more in that CDL light. A CDL, Canal Defense Light. It was a cover name.
It's supposed to be within 8 inches of the mouth, isn't it?
What?
Okay.
I didn't hear what.
Go ahead.
Oh, anyway, and so anyway, they finally figured out, well, this light would work okay in the desert, but you don't have, like in Europe, you go to France, you've got trees, you've got bushes, you've got houses, homes, high-rise buildings, everything. It won't work. Somebody said, oh, yeah, I guess you're right. So retrain us to a medium tank battalion. So our colonel, that was Lieutenant Colonel, his name was Rubel, he was wanting to fight. And he always said, we want to fight. I don't know why he included me in this, because I really didn't want to fight. But anyway, he told him that, and he said, I'd like to get my battalion over there before the war ends. So somebody let him take 2 LST and took the battalion over to France. He landed at Utah Beach. And they said, where do we get our, they had to turn in their tanks, by the way, in England. They said, you'll get new ones when you get to France. So he got to France, and he said, where's my tanks, to the beachmaster? And he says, I don't know anything about tanks, I'm in the Navy. He says, what do you suggest I do? He says, go up to SPA, First Army Headquarters, and he'll tell you what to do. So he sent the exec officer up, and we met him on the east side of Paris. And when he came back, he said to go to the town of Neufchâteau in Belgium, and that you'd get your instructions there. So we went to Neufchâteau, and Colonel Rubel had to go and report to the First Army Commanding General, General Hodges, and he had to explain why he was there, because they said, we really don't want you, we don't need you, but if we happen to need you, well, we know where you are, and stay in that town of Neufchâteau, and we'll get a hold of you if we need you, if and when. He said, well, how about training? He said, we'd like to keep our training going. And he said, well, we'll loan you a couple of tanks, and we may have to take them back from you, so be prepared. So we trained and trained and trained some more. And one of the jobs we had to do while we were waiting for them to call us was to keep peace in the town. I don't know why, the town was very peaceful. And so we had to patrol around and keep people out during the, what do they call it, when you have to be out of off the streets and in your house. I don't know what you call it.
Curfew.
Curfew, that's the word I was thinking of. This fellow was riding around and he saw this lady walking down the road, and he stopped and he says, I'm sorry, ma'am, but you have to go home. The curfew's on. She says, no, I have to go to the hospital. He says, no, you have to go to the hospital, to home. And she says, I have to go to the hospital, and it's very pregnant. So he said, hop in, and he took her to the emergency room. And on the way, she asked him his name, and he gave it to her. Dropped her off and never saw her again until about 50 years later. We went over and we put a big monument up to our unit in the town of Neufchâteau. And as being the MC of the program, why, a lady asked me, a Belgian lady, she says, is Mr. So-and-so there? I don't even remember the guy's name. And I said, yeah, he's here. And she said, I wonder if I could talk to him. I said, sure, I'll go get him. So I brought him out, and the funny thing was, he says, I don't know any ladies. And I said, well, I don't know what kind of women you go with, but I said, this is a Belgian lady that wants to talk to you. Well, I don't know any Belgian ladies. I said, well, she knows you, so let's go. So he went out with me, and I introduced him, and she said, well, she told him his story about how he picked her up and took her to the emergency room. And she said, put his hand out like this to this big gentleman over here. This is my son. And by the way, his name is the same as yours. And he didn't remember any of this stuff, but it all came out in the story. And so when we were going back after she left, well, I told him, I said, you're probably the luckiest guy I've ever run into. He said, how's that? And I said, well, all of us have our wives with us except you. And I said, can you imagine what kind of life you'd lead after being here if your wife knew that some child was named after you? And he said, I never thought of that. Yeah. So that's just a little sidelight.
Why don't we stop there for a minute and let some of the other guys
Yeah,
talk.
okay, sure.
Okay. Morning, Mr. Carlisle. How are you, sir? Okay, Mr. Graham.
Okay.
You wanted to be an aviator when you went to the Army. Is that correct?
Well, when I first went in the Army, I went in the regular Army, and I was in the engineers for a while and transferred to the Air Force. after the war started. I went in before the war started, and so as quick as it started, they put out a order for anyone who would like to be a pilot to go down and take the examination. And so I did, and I passed, and then they sent me spent a day with physical examination. Anyway, I wound up as a pilot trainee, and I didn't finish because I had some problems when I'd get perhaps in a loop, I'd black out. And I told a pilot and my instructor what was happening. He says, well, we can't stand that. He says, you might go to the doctor, and I did, and they operated on me. I wanted to finish so bad, you know, and it didn't have any. So I told him, no, just carry me somewhere else. And that was in basic, you know, I was nearly finished. So they sent me to radio school, and that's how I come to be a radio operator.
So you were a radio operator on B-17s?
That's correct.
You flew 33 missions?
That's right.
Tell me about what you did on a mission.
Oh,
generally.
well.
What was your responsibility as a radio operator?
Okay, I'll tell you this little story, and it'll kind of cover it. We went to London, and that was late in the year, and all the anti-aircraft guns and things had been sent to the Eastern Front on account of the Germans. Not the Germans, but the one they was fighting had pushed them back, and they was afraid that they was going to use the aircraft gun as anyway, coming back, there wasn't any going in, there wasn't any flak or nothing. But coming back, so the main director says, let's drop down to 10,000 feet and get off oxygen. And we did. But what they'd done, there was a river not too far, and they had put a bunch of anti-aircraft guns out there on it, and coming back, they let us have it because we was down to 10,000 feet, and we lost our head pilot. And so our pilot had to take over, and it scared him to death. He had to lead that group all the way home. First thing he did, he asked me to get him a QDM. That's the direction to go, you know, and I did. And I gave it to him, and he says, I don't seem like it's right. I said, well, if you're going to have to use it, that's the only way I can help you. And so we did, and then he kept calling the navigator and asking what he thought about that. He was still scared, you know. He said, I don't know, that ain't my business. Well, finally he said, well, we're going to try it. And I told him, I'll tell you what, in 5 minutes I'll get you another one. But remember now, we might have drifted a little, and don't holler because it's not exactly the same, you know. And so we did. And finally he got us home. And that's about, I don't want to take up too much time,
Sure.
And that's about covered, you know, one of the particulars on the missions.
Well, to complete 33 missions, I bet you feel like you're a lucky man.
Oh, yes, sir, I was. We had some that didn't make it, you know, and some that had to bail out, and then all that. We did have a fire. We had one of the engines started smoking. I could see it out on my side. I called the pilot and told him what I saw. And they went to work, and it took a good while to get that thing under control. He told us how to, we was in over the channel. He told us how to put our parachutes and everything on, you know, or May West and all that. So but it worked out that they did get it. They got it under control, and that was one of the worst you know, one of the worst things we had, really.
Well, I'm going to come back to you in a minute. We're going to talk about the 12 minutes.
Okay, mighty good, all right.
Mr. Carlisle, it's good to have you here.
Pardon me?
It's good to have you here this morning.
Thank you.
Can you talk about when you enlisted? You were also a radio operator, is that correct?
I was a radio operator, yes, sir.
Okay, well, talk about how you enlisted and how you became a radio operator.
Okay. Well, I started off as being a ham operator in high school as a radio amateur, and then when the war broke out, I finished the school year and enlisted, and they said I could have my choice if what I wanted to be in if I qualified, and so I felt very fortunate. I had a pretty good IQ, and they gave me my choice of Signal Corps or Air Corps, and of course I chose the Signal Corps. And believe it or not, they transferred me to the Air Corps, and typical Army. And I spent quite a bit of time in England, France, and Germany, and I never could figure out whether I was a good radio operator or a poor one because I got transferred so much. But I was in a compliment squadron, and every time somebody got sick, I was transferred to replace them till they got well. And I had some good times and bad times, and I made some good friends. Actually, after my wife passed away, I looked up some of the old flames, and I found one of them, but she had been cremated, and so that was out. But, it was war as hell any way you cut it, though. But it was quite an experience for a young man. And I came back home, and I made a good life out of doing radio work. But instead of being an operator, I chose to be a technician. And I was hired by the local utility, and they says, you get a government license, and you got a good job. And so if you don't get one, 6 months out the door. So in 3 months, I got it. And I worked there 32 years. Raised a good family. At least my wife did. She polished me up. I was pretty rough when she got me. But I was married for 67 years, and I had a good life. And I'll be 100 comes next January. And it's such a privilege before you to speak to you. I'm not a very good speaker. However, it's the only course I ever made an A in college. But that was an accident, I think. But I'm available for any questions you folks have to ask me.
We'll get that coming up in just a minute. Manny, do you want to start telling your story, please, for us?
Well, I feel kind of a bit unusual here because I'm the kid. I'm only 87 years old. But with these gentlemen, I'm a kid.
95.
And let me talk to you as when I was a kid. I was not a hero. I was a child. And my job here is to give you at least a picture or a little vignette of what happened during the Second World War. As it says in the book here that I lived in Hungary, which is correct. And if you know anything about the history of the Second World War and the Holocaust, you will know that Hungary had a relationship with the Nazi government of Germany that was unusual or different than any other country, with the exception of Italy. Hungary was an ally. As a consequence, Hungary's involvement in the war didn't happen until quite late. And I want to tell you about a particular incident in my life as a very young child, which I remember very clearly, whose meaning I did not understand at the time at all. My father is from Eastern Hungary, which you would know as Transylvania. That's where Dracula comes from. My father claimed he never met him. My mother comes from Southern Hungary, which is really northern Yugoslavia. If any of you know European history, the Danube flows from Hungary through Yugoslavia all the way down to the Black Sea. In the winter of 1941, early in the war, the war did not affect us in Hungary at all. The war, are we okay?
We're having a hard time hearing you, so I'm going to move the mic up just a little bit more toward, let's see if that
Is
helps.
this better? Yeah. Should I start again? No. I want to tell you about an incident in the winter of 1941. I'm a little guy, 5.5 years old, and my grandparents and an aunt and some others were living in Yugoslavia, southern Hungary, which is where my mother is from, as I said a minute ago. And we took a train from Budapest to my mother's hometown, about a 2.5 hour ride. No incidents whatsoever. The war had not yet affected us at all. We stayed in my mother's sister's house several days, and I recall nothing about being there for those first couple of days. But on a third day or so, I think it was a Friday morning, somebody comes up the stairs or came up the elevator, I don't recall, and said, there's something funky going on the street. Okay? Within 5 minutes of that, knock, knock on the door, and who was at the door but two well-dressed police officers who said, ladies and gentlemen, you need to come outside. We need to conduct a census. Now you need to understand, we do a census every 10 years. The Germans did a census every 15 minutes. Perhaps that's an exaggeration, but the assumption was that if you in fact did a census every 15 minutes, you knew the whereabouts of every person, and they were correct. That was a way of controlling the population. My recollection of that time, of that particular incident, was that they were very courteous, and they said, please get dressed warm. This is winter, December. It's not bitter, but it's winter. My father's recollection was that they were rather obnoxious and rather ordering us what to do. The perceptions of a child 5.5 and the perceptions of his father were quite different at the time. In any case, we got dressed, we put on warm clothes and went outside. We're told to line up on the street for the census, at which point we're told to turn left and start walking in this direction. We walked for a long time, maybe a couple of hours. I walked, my mother carried me, my father carried me, I'm 5.5 years old, I'm a little guy. And we arrived at a place which peculiarly I recognized. We were on a sidewalk. On my left was a 7-foot stockade fence. On my right was a main thoroughfare, big road like Connecticut Avenue here. We were walking along with lots of other people, and a couple of 100 yards ahead of us or so, we saw that the fence had a gate which was open. Now, why did I recognize the place? For those of you who have been to Europe or know Europe, you know that if you're in a city which is not on the sea or not on the lake, rivers become summer beaches. This is on the Danube River, big river, and this was a beautiful beach in the summertime. The beach, the water was perhaps 300 or 400 yards to the left of the fence. It was frozen solid. It was wintertime. Now, in the summertime, this was a beach with hot pools and wave pools and cold pools and thermal pools, restaurants, playgrounds. I'd been there probably in August of that year, a couple of months before, and I remembered the location. What was going on, I did not know, nor did I understand. As we're walking towards this open gate, we noticed that people turn a left turn into the gate, in towards the river. Again, no idea why. As this is taking place, we're now with a group of several people. My grandparents were there, my aunts, my parents, and so forth. And a police officer on the right says to my father, "Mister, what are you doing here?" My father was bewildered, but he said, "Well, I'm visiting with my family." He says, "Well, that's not my question. You're visiting with the family is your business. But what are you doing here? As being part of the census is going to throw off the numbers. I know you're not from here." My father says, "How do you know that?" He says, "Well, I'm a foot patrolman in Budapest, in the neighborhood where you live. I've seen you on the streets many times, going to this or that office, whatever. And as a consequence, I know that you're not from here, and if you were to be counted in the census, that will mess up the numbers. Step aside."
Okay.
So our little group steps aside. And as this happens, within seconds, as I recall, a staff car comes down the main road, a uniformed officer comes out, steps out, talks to some of his comrades, gets on the bullhorn and says, "Ladies and gentlemen, the requirements of the census have been met, go home." There's a school over there. You can stop there and have coffee and hot chocolate. By all means, we did not stop for coffee or hot chocolate. My father found the first taxi he could find to go back to my aunt's apartment. I'm sorry. Now, you might wonder what was going on. None of us knew. But I can tell you, there's a phone call kept coming in. The first call that came in came from my other aunt. My mother had 2 sisters in town. And the aunt said, "Where were you all day?" We told her. She says, "Well, 2 police officers came to our door as well, told us about the census, asked 3 questions, and left." Obviously, their experience was different than ours. As the phone calls began to come in, we began to understand. If any of you know again about the history of the Second World War, there were groups in various countries called partisans. There was some partisan activity which was designed to, in some way, harass the Nazi machine. Explode a bomb, explode a train, explode some tracks, mess things up. And some of these activities took place around this community. And the local leadership decided to, in some way, punish the local community and to show them who's boss. Let me get back a step. Those people who turned left at the gate and marched towards the Danube, which had been opened up, it was 3 feet of ice, but it was broken up that morning by cannon fire. These people were marched to the Danube. Some people claimed that they were told to undress, but whether undressed or not, they were shot into the Danube. Never to be found downriver where the river thinned out, or to be never found until next spring when the river unfroze. We had no understanding of what took place, but several thousand people were so destroyed. What I've described to you is a recollection of a child of a pogrom. Remember that word, P-O-G-R-O-M, a senseless, useless, purposeless killing of people by those who could do it to those who could not in any way resist. This is before the Holocaust, as you know it, began. But this was just an experience of the recollection of a 5.5-year-old child of a pogrom in which he didn't participate, because if he had participated, he wouldn't be here. But here I am to tell you the story from my recollection. Thank you.
Thank you, Manny.
May I ask you something? I wrote a book about my experiences during the Belgian bugs. Would it be permissible to tell them that they can get that book? Or?
Sure, I'll give you just a minute, okay?
Okay. All right.
We've got a few more minutes. We can spend a little bit more time with this panel than we anticipated, which is a good thing. Could you tell me a little bit about the Battle of the Bulge and what you experienced?
Number one, it was cold, extremely cold. And it was also extremely hungry in those days.
In June?
We ran out of food many times and wondered where we were going to get it. But the Army finally came through for us, I should say generally. And it was a strange way to start the war, but we, being a separate battalion, we were assigned to the 30th Division, our first action. And since we had no tanks, we were told when the bulge started, we were told to go to the nearest ordnance depots and take anything we want. And boy, we thought new tanks, finally. We got there, the ordnance people were gone, they had bugged out. And so we had to have every man in our unit go into the ordnance depot and find equipment that they could use. We found 1 or 2 tanks, and we thought, well, we can put those together from parts of others. So we did that, and we got 2 Sherman tanks and 1 tank destroyer. I don't know whether you know what a tank destroyer is or not, but a tank destroyer is what looks like a tank. The only difference is really that you would notice is it doesn't have a roof on the turret. It's an open turret. A stupid thing. I don't know why they did that. They were wide open for hand grenades and everything else, but thank God they did away with it by the end of the war. So anyway, we finally got these 3 vehicles ready. They told us to go down to the train station at the town of Stoumont, Belgium. So we went down there, and the 1st SS Panzer Division, which was called Adolf Hitler Division, they were coming down the road, and the 30th Division infantry troops were in the ditches next to the road, and they were sweating out blood by that time because they could see these German tanks coming at them, and they didn't have anything but the rifles to hold them. So what happened was our first tank came around this big sweeping turn, and he ran in face to face with the first German tank, which was a Panther. He fired and knocked it out, and he started to reload, but the round got stuck into the breech, and so he waited for the second tank to come through. He came around very slowly, and that's one thing you see news and hear stories, you hear about these tanks, he's just going like the devil down the road. That's only when they're down away from the front and going front. When you get up in front of where the enemy is, you're going very slow, and all eyes are back and forth looking because you wanted to make sure you found a hidden tank or a hidden tank destroyer gun before they found you. So the second tank came down, knocked out the second German tank. The third man was called down, and he was in a tank destroyer, as I say. He came around the curve, ran into the third German tank. He put 3 rounds of 90 millimeter shell into this Panther and knocked it out. So these tanks were laying on the road askew like that, and the infantry was able to get up and leave. And we found out that what we had done in the first half hour of combat, we had stopped the 1st SS Panzer Division, and they turned around and retired. So thank God, we thought, well, we had made a little history there. Here we were, excuse the word, but they were well known. We were known as a bastard battalion because we had no parents. We had nobody except wherever the army commander would send us. So what happened was the next thing, the Germans found another way into the town, and they had quite an infantry fight in back of a house by the name of, they call it the Brown House. It's still there. It's still brown and white. And there was a hospital, a Belgian hospital on a hill in the center of town, which is still there. And there's a hill there that comes right up from the street. The hospital is sitting up here this way, and there's this hill which comes up like so. We could get down to the bottom of the hill, but we couldn't get around up to knock out a tank that was sitting at the end of this building. What we had to do, we had to build a corduroy road at night. We built it all night long until 6 o'clock in the morning. I hope you know what a corduroy road is. If not, well, if you got a set of corduroy pants or something at home, you'll see that there's bumps in it, like that. And so what they did, we lay logs or anything we could get traction on, and the tanks could roll over it. So we built this corduroy road, went up the hill, and worked on it all night. And by the time, about 6 o'clock in the morning, the next morning, we were able to get up and fire at this Panther tank that was sitting at the top. And the tank was sitting there with his main gun facing the hospital, and the infantrymen had hidden in the hospital to get away from the Germans because they had nothing backing them up until we showed up. So this German tank would fire down the hallway, and every time one of the infantrymen tried to get out of the rooms that they were stuck in, why, they'd fire another round through, so they figured, well, the better thing to do is to stay hidden. So we finally knocked out that tank at 6 o'clock in the morning, and we freed these 30th Division troops. We went.
Let's leave it there.
All right.
Thank you.